Welcome back to another Canadian Business History Talk. Today, I'm joined by Brian Gettler, Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto, to discuss his recent article, The Vincent-Picard Family's Investments, Wendat Wealth and Notarized Contracts in the Mid-19th Century. In this conversation, we're going to be exploring how one Wendat family built and managed significant wealth in 19th century Lower Canada, what notarial records reveal about Indigenous participation in credit markets, and why these histories even matter for Canadian business history today. I'm Tabitha Fritz, board member of the Canadian Business History Association, and I will be your host for today's conversation. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thank you. So let's get into it. If you could please, tell everyone about the article for anyone who hasn't read it, what's in the article, what the story is, and what kind of led you to doing this type of research.
Okay, so right, the article, what it does is it's looking at the wealth investment strategies of the Picard Vincent family, and so they're a family who reside in Jeune-Lorette. It's known as also Wendake, so the Wendat community just outside of Quebec City in the 19th century. And they basically they follow a pattern that's quite similar to many other families in Lower Canada at the time. So families that basically as their forebears had, whenever possible for generations, invested any surplus money they had in lands. And from the 1830s, there's a kind of an important shift, two important shifts I trace in the kind of socio-legal world and the market that lead them into investing in loans rather than lands. And those are, first of all, a couple of decisions in 1830 by canon courts in Rome that basically allow for loans at interest to no longer be considered usurious. So that is as not sinful. And these get the decisions happen in 1830, but they only kind of they only circulate in Lower Canada 5 years later or so. And the second is the Panic of 1837. So this really important financial crisis that hits the North Atlantic, famously the US and Britain, but Canada also is pulled into this. And this leads to a kind of credit crunch for both the largest creditors, so the banks, but then also the kind of medium-sized creditors that might have served relatively modest families and their needs for credit. And as this happens, basically the Picard Vincent family decide to shift their strategy away from land, and they do it quite dramatically. It happens very quickly, and towards loans to their neighbors. They do this goes to both some institutions, so the local church, for example, borrows money from them, but more so it's really these funds go to neighboring French Canadian settlers who are looking to buy lands, to open new farms, to expand farms they already have in the region. And so they're providing essentially mortgages, the family, and in exchange for 6% annual interest, which is the legal rate at the time. They managed to make quite a bit of money doing this, and then they reinvest that. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but their business is basically manufacturing things like snowshoes and moccasins that they sell really across the continent. So business has been going well, so they have funds for that, and this kind of, they reinvest their money that they make off of these loans into their family business. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically the story I'm telling, I guess.
And one of the things I thought was so interesting, because, in most of us living in 2026, the idea of religious-based economic laws it's pretty foreign. right? So how important were religious changes, like the changes to the Catholic doctrine saying, you know, this is no longer usury? How important were those changes in enabling these sort of new financial practices? Was that like really the biggest driver of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's two things, but I think that's an absolute, like, that's absolutely central, right? People, especially in Lower Canada, and this is rural Lower Canada, is overwhelmingly Catholic, right? And so all of these people will attend, church regularly, and the priest, the parish priest, has quite a bit of power over the local society. So he's able to stand up, and in fact, parish priests do this, in the pulpit, and basically shame members of the congregation who are seen to be behaving in ways that are inappropriate. And of course, part of this as well, I mean, so it's not just peer pressure. I mean, part of this as well is, what I think we could call authentic religious belief. I have no way of knowing whether, Picard and Vincent were deep believers or not. But certainly this is part of the kind of the milieu in which they find themselves. And this is, you can't, if you were seen to be infringing Catholic doctrine in this way, you could very easily be shunned. And so in many communities like this, people are just not going to take that risk. And so this change to Catholic doctrine is really important, and in opening up, I guess, these sorts of this kind of wealth to this sort of strategy of growing that wealth.
And do you think that change in doctrine came like as a result of the Panic of 1837? Like the Catholic Church said, we have to open this up in order to continue to expand, our mission and get to people, our parishioners? Or were those things unrelated, and the Panic of 1837 was just sort of something that coincidentally happened to happen at the same time?
Yeah, it's really more of a coincidence. So this is what's happening is, I mean, there's pressure, particularly in Europe and in Catholic countries, to allow for people to invest funds at the legal rate, whatever that happens to be. Each country had a kind of different legal rate. We're seeing industrialization, for decades by this point in Britain, but in mainland Europe as well. And there's a kind of understanding that the system as it exists is preventing Catholic families from engaging in the business world in quite the same way as others. So generally Protestant and Jewish families who don't have these sorts of controls on their use of credit. And so, but of course, this doesn't stop everyone. There are plenty of Catholics who are not paying attention to this particular law, but it does make it more difficult. And so when this happens and the Panic of 1837 together, they're kind of this sort of dual impetus to change the family's strategies.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned was before the Catholic Church shifted its doctrine and before the Panic of 1837, the family was primarily investing in real estate, right? Local real estate in the area. I'm just curious because I didn't see it in the article. What were they doing with that real estate? Was it just sort of amassing land? Were they selling it to other people? Were they renting it out? What were they doing with it?
So they weren't doing much with it at all. I mean, on occasion they would rent farms, so they bought farms. They do buy. I do say at the very end of the article, one thing that they have done is they buy the land and the house in which the notary lives. So the person who's drawing up these contracts actually is their tenant, right? So they are doing kind of those sorts of things. But by and large, their land acquisition strategy is more of a kind of nest egg. This is how the family invests its surplus funds that it doesn't need immediately. If it were to require those, it could sell land. Though of course we know that that's not something you can do on a dime, right? It takes a bit of time to arrange those sorts of things. The same thing, of course, goes for investing in loans, right? You can't necessarily call in the principal on a loan immediately. So that doesn't necessarily change. But what does change is they are making sort of superior profit, I guess, on their turn to the money market versus the land market.
Yeah, that was an interesting conflict of interest with the notary that they used being their tenant, right? Could you just briefly explain how notary-based credit system functioned in Lower Canada for listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, so this is, I think, one of the key contributions of the article, and this draws on historiography from largely from France, but from other places too that use this sort of Roman civil law notarial system, places like Mexico, for example, that has often, I think, or for a long time, kind of confounded scholars of business and histories of capitalism in the English-speaking world, because we don't have notaries. So we're used to the term notary public, but a notary public is not at all a notary. A notary is basically sort of like a junior lawyer. They are a legal professional who has extensive training in basically composing contracts. So rather than going to a lawyer to get a contract drawn up, you would go in French civil law. So in Quebec, you go to a notary. And that notary has expertise on all sorts of, the ins and outs of various contracts. So they can be, partnership contracts. So the sort of, a creation of business, but they can also be land sales or rental contracts, loan contracts, things like wills as well are quite frequently there. And so if you look at Quebec, one of the pieces here from to explain its usefulness as a historical source is both that it has all of this sort of information in it, but also that notaries were required and still are required to deposit their contracts with provincial authorities. And so we have fairly complete collections of notaries, what are known as notary studies. So basically all of the contracts that they drew up over their career, going back to New France. And this gives us huge amounts of information. So we can do business history like this, but we could also do things, and this is quite common, kind of deep sort of social history, where we're able to find information on everyday people who otherwise totally escape the notice of the archival record. So people who are not, famous politicians or business leaders, just people who are going about their everyday lives, many of whom are illiterate, and so have left us, very, very little. In the archival record, we can find a whole lot about them. And so I would say there was a boom in historical scholarship in Canada in the 60s and 70s, and in Quebec, looking at these sorts of sources. And there's been a bit of a lull over the past few decades. And very few people prior to the last couple of years have tried to use these sources to do Indigenous history. And this is starting to change. So we get a view of certain things in Indigenous communities in Quebec that we kind of don't have in the rest of the country because of these, because of this really important figure that is the notary.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there are other communities or archives where similar stories are likely waiting to be uncovered, like through their notary records? Or go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, there's more work to be done in Wendake, and I know this because I've read some of the documents. But for the purpose of writing an article, I had to stop somewhere, and so I decided to focus on this single family. But certainly, in places like Ganawage or Ganasatake, Odanak, most of the communities in the St. Lawrence Valley have this for sure. When you get a little bit outside of that, so the Innu on the North Shore or the Saguenay, for example, you have some notarial archives, but they tend to start a bit later because notaries are one of these kind of key figures in settlements of land in Quebec. So you get them, at the same time as you get parish priests turning up, or at the same time as you get teachers. So they're kind of a key player. But if you don't have these other institutions, on the ground, you often don't have a notary. So, places like one community I've looked a bit at is Maastricht, so on Lake St. John, and you only get a notary in that region really from kind of towards the end of the 19th century. So it's a slightly different thing, but these archives are available. And rich and waiting to be jumped into by who's ever interested, and I would say brave enough to do so, because they are not the easiest thing to work with.
Yeah, like one of the things you noted was that Marguerite Vincent, and I'll say her name in English because your French is way better than mine, but you noted that she really only appears sort of on the margins of these records, right? When it seemed like from your article that in fact she was maybe one of the driving forces of the family's economic success. So what are the challenges of reading notarial contracts when Indigenous women often appear only indirectly in the documents?
Yeah, so I mean, this is similar, I would say, to women's history in general, right? In these kinds of documents, the legal system is patriarchal, so everything goes through the husband's line. In fact, when you look at these contracts, they often say, so the contracts I worked on would often say Paul-Picard and uxor. So uxor is spouse in Latin. And so you don't actually know, right? You don't get her name there. So you have to figure this out from context. But there are a few contracts that she does sign. He does not sign the contracts. She does. She is. Her father was a school teacher. Based on that and a number of contextual elements, she seems to be much more the well-educated member of the family. Their son as well, François Xavier, gets a very good education too. So he and eventually takes over the family business. But these are the sorts of things that are sometimes very difficult to nail down. But in her case, she outlives her husband, and she continues to run the business, though it's not, necessarily immediately apparent, because again, in the documents, we're constantly talking about the men. But we have evidence to suggest, for example, that Paul-Picard, so her husband, is, his forte really is hunting and doing things like making snowshoes. It's not necessarily balancing the books, running the business, coming up with the contracts. Though, of course, he would be the one to go to the notary, because this is what the system kind of required.
Right. Yeah. And it seemed from the article as well that the family was quite wealthy compared to many of the others in their village or in their area. I'm wondering if there were moments during your archival research where the scale of the family's wealth surprised you.
So I've been working on Wendake for a long time now. So I would say writing this article, I wasn't surprised, okay. But I have been certainly in the past. And I think this is one of the points I make in the introduction to the article, is that often we imagine Indigenous communities as being sort of unitary, right? As being everyone in the community is exactly the same. It's a sort of homogenous view that we often have from the outside. But of course, this isn't true, right? Like, we all know that we have different, everyone has different levels of wealth. Some people are great, some people maybe aren't great. There are interpersonal conflicts, and these kinds of things exist in Indigenous communities, and existed in Indigenous communities as much as in others. And I think that one of the issues often is when we're confronted with this sort of difference in wealth in Indigenous communities, we find it kind of shocking. And I guess one of my arguments is to say it maybe is, but in fact, it's similar to other societies at the time and since, right? And so I think we need to, when we're shocked, if we find it shocking, I think we need to ask ourselves why. And we need to think maybe a bit more closely about kind of our ideas of indigeneity and Indigenous communities.
Mhm. Yeah, you argued that wealth accumulation produced class formation within Wendake. So, did you see any evidence of how this economic differentiation was expressed either socially or politically?
Yeah, so this plays out over generations, right? So we see, so their son, for example, François Xavier, he becomes Grand Chief. Um, Paul Picard is not a chief. And one of my kind of feelings is that he's not a chief for a number of reasons. He's not from the right family, but also he's like a colleague of mine quipped to me once when I was talking about this. They said, he's too busy making money to be a political leader. And in a sense, I think that's true. He's engaged in the family business and not politically. But we see, so their son becomes Grand Chief. Their grandson becomes a notary himself. They have great grandchildren who go on one of them is Louis-Philippe Armand Picard is the highest ranking Indigenous officer in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. His brother is also is a chief and also Indian agent. So there's in this family you see a kind of a change in role, I guess, political role, social role in the community. You see education being very important. And then you see it also class formation in other families that kind of follow this model in different ways. The most obvious one in the 20th century, but this starts in the late 19th century, is the Bastian family. And they absolutely begin, they kind of shift the strategy away from outside of the reserve. So investing in mortgages outside the reserve to investing inside the reserve. And so they begin buying up many houses in Wendake itself. They also, by the 20th century, they're running the major manufacturing, so snowshoe and moccasin manufacturing businesses, and they own the biggest grocery store, through which all of the funding for welfare flows. And so they managed to kind of control the economy of the reserve, where they, not so subtly threaten people who take their welfare money to a competing store by saying, you will not get a job working for us if you do this. And they also, they remove people from houses who are not paying. They're very kind of aggressive in this sense. So you see this kind of shift in the kind of common people and these few families who manage to control the means of production and wealth just more generally.
Do you see any tensions in the fact that it was Indigenous capital, at least in your case story, that helped underwrite settler expansion in the region?
Yeah, so this is I would say maybe one of the surprising pieces of the article. In fact, I think Wendake is relatively well integrated into the area. There have been a number of studies looking at 19th century the 19th century Quebec City, Wendake region. And while it's true that there's a bit of exotic, basically Wendat are portrayed, I guess, in newspapers, in books and so forth as being kind of exotic. And so they become sort of a tourist attraction. There's also, clear evidence that they have, especially the sort of elite families, have direct ties to elite families in Quebec City and to the kind of, sort of gentry, I guess, of the rural areas around. And so, I mean, I haven't seen any kind of direct evidence of this causing a stir so much as it being just sort of what is happening here. I think the reading of this being kind of problematic, the expansion of settler farms and so forth, I mean, I think that reading would be a modern reading. Because even by this point, so for example, many Wendat continued to hunt and fish, but they didn't do it immediately adjacent to the reserve because there was too much population already in the area. So, game basically was not abundant close to where they lived. So they had to travel already to do these sorts of things. And I think that would have been the primary kind of source of tension had it existed at the time.
So zooming out a little bit and on sort of a broader level, what do you think this case study changes about how we should think about capitalism and colonialism in 19th century Canada?
Yeah, I think it makes it complicated, right? That's the historian joke. It's complicated. I think that what it needs to make us think about is the story. So I think the story of capitalism, colonialism with respect to Indigenous peoples over the long term is certainly a story of subjugation. But that doesn't mean that it's a story of subjugation everywhere and all the time, right? And so there are moments where certain actors are able to benefit, to sort of to win in this the system in different ways, and I think we need to take that seriously, both for relationships to kind of settler society, to markets around the world, but also in terms of what that means internally, as I was saying a few minutes ago. And so I think what this does in a very real sense is it complicates these stories. And frankly, I think that's a good thing, because I think often we fall into these, really kind of oppositional positions, right? We imagine that things are all black and white. And history, if it does anything, is it demonstrates to us that that's basically never the case. Mm-hmm. And so I think here, with respect to colonialism and capitalism, we see that, these forces can create outcomes that, aren't what we would necessarily assume they would create.
Yeah, I think one of my big takeaways from the article was that, no group is a monolith, right? There are always individual and unique stories happening completely within that group. And if you have a perspective that you can identify a group with one, ubiquitous sort of statement or idea, then you simply haven't looked into it enough and you don't have enough information. So what would you say, and this is my final question for you because we're running out of time, but what would you say is your hope that either readers of the article or listeners to this podcast will take away from the story?
Yeah, I think that's sort of it, that we need to look more deeply. And I think that notarial archives, for example, are a great way to do this. One of the things about them is that they're a different kind of source. So, historians have to work to understand our sources and their nature, right? And so a notarial contract is quite different, say, than a speech or a public, a petition, which are the kinds of things that when we're working on Indigenous history, we often work with. So these are, a petition, for example, is kind of a public-facing, or at least a sort of state-facing or power-facing document. And so it's performative in a way that a contract often isn't. These are documents that are not, they're not found on the public, in the public sphere. They are agreements between individuals, and in that sense, they're perhaps, and I don't want to say they're more honest, but they provide a different perspective on what's happening. And often the kinds of things that, people don't really want to talk about in public, right? And of course, people who do business history are well aware of this, that, one of the hardest things is often to get access to a company's archives, because, they don't want us snooping around, pulling things out that maybe are unsavory or maybe make them appear, incompetent or whatever. But of course, this is exactly where the kind of interesting stuff lies. And so I think yeah, I think that the sort of the call to investigate different forms of information, different kinds of archives, I think is an important important piece of this project and what I'd like to see happen going forward.
So actually, I'm going to sneak in one last question because I would like to know, based on that response, if you were advising graduate students who are interested in Canadian business history today, where would you tell them to look next?
I mean, I just made a pitch for the Notarial Archive, so maybe I would say that. Though, of course, I would caution them that this is really this is difficult labor. So these a notarial contract can be, you know, 4, 5, 6 more pages of handwritten, often very difficult to read material. And in order to do a kind of a solid job of analyzing them, you may need, you know, hundreds or thousands of these documents, right? So this article draws on a corpus of several hundred, up to 700 notarial archives that I used just for this, and so it can be a lot of work. But the payoff, I think, can be really great, and it can lead to a richer understanding of business history that we don't have elsewhere. There are other things too, and it's not. So I'm talking much about Lower Canada, but things there are archives that are similar, and there's some that are quoted, or at least articles that use them that are quoted in the piece for Upper Canada too. So you don't have to do Lower Canada, though. I would like to see more people do that myself.
Yeah, lots of places to look. Brian, thank you again so much for joining us to share this really very important and illuminating research. Listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation, please give the video a like and share it with someone else that you think would get some value from it. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you're notified whenever we post a new episode. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the Canadian Business History Association, you can visit our website at cbha.ca to learn more. On behalf of the entire CBHA, thank you for tuning in to this Canadian Business History Talk, and we will see you in the next one.